Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
We're so pleased to welcome our guest back from last week, Dominic Polara, who is from Wisconsin, and a number of us have been so fascinated with his book that was published last year by Continuum Publishers in London and New York. The name or title of the book is Visible Differences, Why Race Will Matter to Americans in the 21st Century, and this is how the book looks. You can get it in either hardback or paperback. It's a very, very excellent book, and we're very pleased to have him back. Our guest spent a lot of time preparing this book. In fact, he worked on it for 7 years, and during that time he visited all 50 states in America, and he also did studies in other countries, including such countries as Spain, Italy, Japan, Greece, Russia, Brazil, Canada, Mexico, Sweden, Turkey, Argentina, Singapore, South Africa, United Kingdom, and the Dominican Republic. It's not been my pleasure to interview any author in the past that visited so many places before he completed his work, and it's so highly documented, everything in the book. Welcome back, Dominic. We're so pleased to have you back and to continue our discussion from last week.
It's wonderful to be here, Tony. Thank you for having me.
I'm so pleased to have our panel back from last week, Denise Clark, who's a librarian at North Idaho College, and next to her is Erna Reinhardt, who is Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College, and we'll ask Denise to start today's questioning.
Dominic, I know a previous program we discussed your book, Visible Differences, and I'm sure we'll come back to this book. But I'd like to ask you what current projects you're working on, if you could share that with the audience. I know that you have another book in the works, and another project that I think our audience would be very interested in learning about. So,
in the near future, I'm going to complete a sequel to this book about white males in multicultural America. And the working title, the proposed title, is Sharing the Dream, because that embodies my theme, my thesis, that white males in our country are sharing the dream with people who aren't white males, with women and people of color. Now, some are doing so voluntarily, and others are doing so involuntarily. But sharing the dream, they are. And I explore that in a wide variety of ways, and at the same time look at the diversity of white male America in terms of such factors as ethnicity, national origin, regional background, socioeconomic status, occupation, sexual orientation, and so many other factors. And the topic itself is something I wanted to explore because there is attention paid to white males in our media, but oftentimes it's about hot-button issues. Back in the mid-'90s, when the topic first began to interest me, there was a lot of talk about angry white males and affirmative action and militias and things like that. And those are important topics, and I cover them in the project I'm working on right now. At the same time, most white males in our country are not overtly hostile to ethnic and racial diversity. Some aren't very comfortable with it, and some are trying to increase their comfort levels. Others would prefer to be in more homogeneous areas, and we're seeing some movement from very heterogeneous parts of our country, like New York and California, to more homogeneous places, such as Idaho. Some of the folks in Idaho have come from California. And that doesn't mean that they came here because they were fleeing ethnic and racial diversity. I want to make that very clear. But when people talk about white flight in a regional sense, Idaho is one of the places that's mentioned. Of course, in the context of the fact that there's a great quality of life here. Housing prices are decent. You get a nice house for a reasonable price. And it's a great environment in which to raise your children. A growing number of white males, particularly in my generation, and also in the baby boom generation, is trying to embrace our multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural reality. People do this in different ways. And I should say, before I get into that a little bit, we have to make it very clear that it's impossible to quantify how many people, how many white males in our society are comfortable with diversity and how many aren't. And we can't quantify it. I mean, there are different polls and such, but there's a lot of diversity in white male America. And some fellows are educators, and they try to teach a narrative of our nation's literature or history that truly reflects our past, our present, and our future. Others are in corporate America, and as part of their work, they may try to make sure that people who aren't white and male have the same kinds of opportunities they have. There are people in the field of religion, different faiths, many different faiths. We're doing valuable work in terms of ministering to people from different groups, and so forth. And there are many fascinating stories, many of which aren't in the national media. Like, for instance, I profile a fellow who is principal of a high school in Gallup, New Mexico, and virtually all of the students there are of color. They're of color, Native American and Hispanic. This fellow's white, he's from the area, and the school board that selected him is 3 Native Americans out of the 5 members. Sometimes you get a situation in which you'll have a community where a majority of the people are minorities, but the power structure, and this happens all the time, is predominantly white. But this is a case where a majority of the school board is made up of minorities, and they chose a white man to do this job because they thought he was competent. And he makes it very clear that race is not a significant factor in his life. He's going to treat everybody equally. One of the other people who's profiled in the book is the mayor of Gary, Indiana. He's white. It's a city that's over 83% black, and it's been a popular mayor. I mean, this is a city that's 10% white and 83% black. And he's a popular mayor. And this is not one of these cases where the electorate is majority white even though the population isn't. This is a white man who was elected by black voters. And it's stories like that, and also other aspects of life in our country, some of which aren't explicitly related to race. One of the topics that fascinates me the most is changing gender roles in the American family. Guys are helping out more around the house. They're playing more involved roles in the child rearing process, things like that. And that's all part of, and then we have a small but growing number of full-time fathers, and they encounter some very interesting experiences because people in many parts of our country aren't completely used to dads being the full-time caregivers of the children while the mothers go out and earn the money for families. We're at a position now, a time in our history, in which 30% of women out-earn their husbands. Now, there is a pay gap. There is a pay gap in our society, and it's still, women still, as a group, earn less than 80 cents on the dollar to men, and that is wrong. At the same time, we want to indicate that we're seeing a lot of progress. And I even am covering some instances where white males are receiving affirmative action. Now, to be fair, some analysts say white males have received affirmative action throughout American history. I'm not talking about that type of affirmative action, although I write about that in the book. Saying that they had a monopoly where 45% of the population had 100% of the opportunities. Analysts are increasingly describing that as a form of affirmative action, and
a quota.
Right, take that into perspective. I'm talking about a different kind of affirmative action in that, because women now constitute 57% of our undergraduate students on the nation's campuses, there are some universities that don't want, in their opinion, the gender balance to get too far out of whack, so they're judging male applicants, many of whom happen to be white, by less rigorous standards. And that's one example of how, there are a couple factors going on here. Our ethnic and racial heterogeneity is increasing, but at the same time, on a parallel track, we're seeing greater sensitivity to to the needs and feelings and rights of people who felt left out. Whether it's people of size who may feel that it is discriminatory, that they should have to buy 2 seats on an airplane instead of having the airline, accommodate them with their 1 seat. Openly gay men and lesbians have been advocating for rights. There's even been some talk in parts of our country of extending affirmative action to them.
We're going to need to move on. That
Okay.
was just absolutely fascinating what you're going to do, and I'm sure we'll have you back when that book comes out. I'm just fascinated with it. I don't believe that there's anyone in America in writing that's doing that thesis like you are. It would be great to see that later. Erna Reinhardt.
Dominic, I might be getting your projects mixed up because I'm a little confused, but I believe that one of your projects also has a North Idaho connection, and I'm not sure if that's the book that you were just referring to or if that's a separate project. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. As part of the research for the book about white males, there is a lengthy 1,000-word vignette that opens the chapter about the interplay between human rights and white supremacy. That vignette focuses on a number of people in North Idaho, particularly 3 men who happen to be white. Professor Stewart, Norman Gissel, who's an attorney in Coeur d'Alene, and Marshall Mend, who's a realtor in Hayden. These 3 men have been involved in human rights for a couple of decades. And the work that they've been doing in concert with other people in this community is nothing short of remarkable. I've been conducting research on human rights in different parts of our country, and I feel confident now to say that there's no other instance anywhere in the United States where human rights activists, as in those in Kootenai County and surrounding areas, have come together, worked so hard for so long with so much success. It's a very special story. And as I delved into it, there's a book there. And I talked to Professor Stewart about the topic to see if somebody who's a local here would want to do it, because there are a number of excellent writers in the area who have lived this story, and for various reasons, in part because of scheduling issues, like some people, they just don't have the time. They don't have the time. They'd like to do it, but they don't have the time. So I'd like to develop a project that explores, and I'm doing the research already, that explores what has gone on here in the Inland Northwest in terms of human rights in the context of national and international events. Because what happens is, when you look at the story in the context of national and international events, focusing, of course, on what has gone on here. I mean, that's what one focuses on. But by putting it in the context of what's going on around the U.S. and around the world, in the West at least, one starts to really gain an appreciation for how special this story is. And if you look at what the human rights activists have done here, there are some lessons. I think people, not only in the U.S. but in other places, they can draw from these experiences. Because I'm an outsider, so this is the perspective of an outsider. But what human rights activists here in North Idaho, one of the things they've done so right, what they've really done a wonderful job of doing, is avoiding overt confrontations with a small group of people who express views that are just not part of the mainstream of American thought. One of the aspects of this topic is that the human rights activists have demonstrated a consistent, and Professor Stewart, of course, is the expert, have demonstrated a consistent ability, a remarkable ability to use different tactics, different strategies to maintain the support of the community and the interest of the media. And that brings me to the whole issue of the image of North Idaho in particular and Idaho in general. I feel, just my opinion, but I feel that the people of Idaho have gotten a bad rap. They've just gotten a bad rap. If one looks at the number of extremists in North Idaho, I mean, they exist, there's no question about it, but there aren't that many. And it's simply amazing to me how, in many respects, a small group of people could, to some extent, define the image of an entire state, an entire region. And it boggles my mind. And as one, as someone who detests stereotypes of all kinds, I feel that the people of Idaho, it does. Some of the media images about them do not represent the reality, and I'd like to get into that in the book.
Well, with your statement, it's very humbling for us. You're so kind and you're so
I'm
articulate,
but stating the facts. Stating the facts.
Somewhat embarrassing, but it's so wonderful that you express such great support. I do want to finish the rest of the program with this wonderful, wonderful book that you wrote. As a political scientist and someone who's also been a human rights activist, I do think that this is really a textbook to be used, in my view, in education. And one thing I'd like to get you to spend some time on, one thing that impressed me so much about your book is that it's so balanced. That is, you recognize the problems and you recognize what has been wrong in race relations and the horrendous things such as slavery and segregation and what happened to Native Americans and all. At the same time that you tell that, you also, in a very, very effective way, talk about our progress, the pricking of our conscience and the changes. And so what I'd like to get you to do, based on that, with not enough time to deal with such a detailed book, but talk some about your optimism, because it certainly is in here, about what you see in the future. And I guess I have a two-part question. What is your optimism about our having very positive interracial friendships and relations in the future is one thing that I'd like to have some comments on. And then secondly, other than, I guess, Brazil, I believe you indicated that we are a lab unlike anything in the world. There's no other countries that have had the opportunity, as President Clinton used to say, how enriched we are by our diversity. So if you could take us down that road, both with your optimism and also what makes us unique in this issue.
I will say this, and what I'm about to say is not something everyone agrees with, and in other parts of the world I've been challenged on this. But that said, I believe that there's no nation or empire in the history of the world that has been as successful as we have been here in the United States in terms of integrating so many different people from so many different backgrounds. As Professor Stewart pointed out, Brazil is perhaps the main contender. Sometimes people will point to smaller multi-ethnic societies, but with what we're talking about here is we're talking about large countries with lots of people. In our country, one might find 100,000 people of Armenian ancestry in one part, 40,000 people of Finnish ancestry in another part, and 110,000 people of Haitian ancestry in yet another part. And there are very few countries, in fact, the only big one that has that kind of diversity besides ours is Brazil. But Brazilians might dispute this, but I believe we have more ethnic and racial diversity. And one thing that we've done that our friends in Brazil are just starting to do is that we've come to terms, or we're trying to come to terms, we're actively trying to come to terms with our history. And it hasn't been a very good history in terms of the treatment of people of color. And one might argue compellingly that there clearly are disparities and inequities in the present, and many people, many policymakers are also trying to get beyond those as well. Now in Brazil, their race relations between blacks and whites and people in between are in many respects better than ours. One can go to a shopping mall in Brazil and see someone who by North American standards is white walking hand in hand with someone who by North American standards is black, and no one thinks anything of it. And increasingly in certain parts of America, it's the same way. Although, I want to make it very clear that the intermarriage rates, which are rising, are the lowest for whites and blacks. And intermarriage, of course, is a very important test about how people feel. There are many people who are very tolerant individuals, and not just white people either, who draw the line at intermarriage. And they say all the right things, and they're decent people. But when it comes to intermarriage, They're not into it. And the same is true about religion. What Dr. Martin Luther King said about 11 a.m. on Sunday mornings continues to be true to a large part, in terms of we Americans tend to worship around people or with people who are from the same group. Now in North Idaho, which is predominantly white, that does not indicate racial hostility. I mean, because when most people are white, you expect in a given congregation most of the people are going to be white. But in more multi-ethnic and multiracial places, one can be surprised, or not surprised, but we'll find it kind of interesting that certain congregations are composed mainly of people from one group or another. Now in terms of, if I just may go back to Brazil very quickly, Brazil is finally starting to look at colorism, the colorism that exists there, in that even though race relations are more fluid, there is discrimination against darker-skinned people, and they're starting to have affirmative action and a consciousness of these issues. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out. Now, in terms of where we're going as a nation, I'm a cautious optimist like so many Americans are. We're an optimistic people. Saying we can't do something is not in our vocabulary. And as a nation, we're ambivalent. What we tell pollsters is that all the right things. You find very few people who would say to a pollster that the person would have any objection to someone from a different group moving in next door, or voting for someone from a different group for president, things like that. And it's hard to tell exactly how people feel, because racism has become so unfashionable. Overt expressions of racism have become so unfashionable in our society that nobody wants to be called a racist or identified as one. In fact, some of the supremacists will say they're like racialists or something, because the term racist has become so loaded that even some of them don't want to be identified with it. And the thing is, if we have to look at the data. Again, let's look at intermarriage for a moment. The intermarriage rates for native-born whites and native-born Latinos and Asian Americans are pretty high. They're pretty high. We're seeing a lot of intermarriage, and in certain parts of our society where there's a lot of diversity, people go to school with each other. It's natural that they fall in love, they form unions, and have children. The one, as I was saying earlier, the one instance where we're seeing an increasing amount of black-white intermarriage, but not nearly as much in percentage terms as you'd see of like Anglos and Latinos and whites and Asians. But where I come from in Wisconsin, there was a time 20-some years ago where you would have never seen a black person and a white person together. But beginning around 1990, it started to become, I wouldn't say very common, but it wasn't something that would draw any attention anymore. And nowadays at the mall, you'll see a woman who looks like you do, blonde and German ancestry, walking with a child who's half black, and her husband will be with her, and it's not something that's unusual. And this is in Wisconsin, rural southeastern Wisconsin, which is predominantly white. We also see couples, whites and Latinos together, and then they'll have their children with them. So intermarriage is one important indicator. Another indicator that's very interesting. I mean, we can look at how African Americans, many of them are enjoying significant progress in an economic sense, even though all too many of them languish in poverty. There are indicators like that, and many people of color are doing very well in our society in an economic sense. There are many who aren't, but we're seeing a lot of progress in that sense. In terms of the representation of our nation's diversity, in so many aspects, we're seeing a lot of progress. George Bush, our president, he has the most diverse set of appointees of any Republican president. That's an important distinction. Republican president in history. To the point, in 2001, that some white males were grumbling that he wasn't hiring enough of them. And that's one of those small things that indicates that, one might say it's tokenism, and I'm not saying either way, but at least there's a commitment in a rhetorical sense to diversity. in the Republican Party, which has not been known as a bastion of diversity. The Democrats, of course, are much more committed to that, in part because their base is much more heterogeneous in ethnic and racial sense than that of the Republicans. Now, again, just to illustrate the complexity of the topic, Republicans have been campaigning among people of color now for a number of years, but some of the cynics say they're doing so not because they feel they're going to win many black votes, which they aren't, to some extent for Latino votes, but also to win votes among moderate whites, because moderate whites don't want to vote for candidates who are perceived to be intolerant. Now, one other factor that deserves attention is what has been described as like regional flight, in that hundreds of thousands of white people have left the ethnically and racially diverse bastions of like Los Angeles and New York in the last decade, 10 to 15 years, and gone to places that are more homogeneous. And interestingly, I don't think anybody's quantified it yet definitively, but we're also seeing a more modest amount of black out-migration. Now, some of that is to the American South, because the American South traditionally, it's where a majority of African Americans live today, and the percentage is growing. But some people speculate that whites, and to a lesser extent blacks, are leaving places like Los Angeles because they're not super comfortable with the fact that there are many immigrants, many of whom don't speak English very well, and there's a very big focus on multiculturalism.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. It's been so great having you, Mr. Polara, Dominic Polara, on our program with his remarkable book called Visible Differences. I would ask our staff to put up on the screen our telephone number at our library where the book can be checked out, but more importantly, the website where you could order the book. Again, it's in both hardback and in paperback, and again, it's called Visible Differences, Why Race Will Matter to Americans in the 21st Century, and it's by Continuum Publishers. And of course, wherever you are, your local bookstores could also order the book for you. We would highly recommend it for it's just so excellent on dealing with race in America, and it's very, very comprehensive work. Mr. Polara, thank you for being here for 2 weeks. We've enjoyed having you here, and you had a great audience at our campus, and we hope to have you back in the future. Again, good luck on all your work.
Thank you, Professor Stewart. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join us again next week, and we'll change it to another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.